and I'll be chairing today's exciting adventure news. If you've not been to one of these things before, I thought I should just briefly explain that the big idea is really that one of the problems of journalism is that journalists know a lot about journalism, but they don't know a lot about everything else. And what we need to do is basically co-opt you into helping us understand what it is we should be looking at, because frankly, you'll have a broader understanding of the universe than we do. In a slightly strange time at the moment, obviously, where we're all stuck, well, most of us, lots of us are stuck in our homes, working away. So lots of normal journalistic stuff we would normally be doing, we can't really do. And we have to find ways of reporting on what we can in novel ways. If you look at the dashboard in front of you on Zoom, there's a thing, you can click on the chat and you can contribute to the chat there. If you look at someone called Liz Mosley, who will be pestering you and moderating to some minor degree conversation. And if you have a look at participants, the participants tab, there will be a little button that says raise hand. If you have a go at raising your hand, that's helpful too. I'll be able to see that you can that you're following along. That's useful if there's something you really want to say in this conversation, so that we can come to you. If you want to speak on camera, raise your hand. If you say something interesting in the chat, though, I warn you, I may just come to you. The thing I thought we'd start with today is the stuff we published this morning, which is an attempt to put some numbers around what's happening in the British economy, which is a bit of a mystery. We've got this very strange sort of recession where not only have we had this very sudden stop in the economy, but we've also got this very strange position that we can't go out and report it. Like we're not traveling around the country. We're not seeing the things we would normally see. And that means that we can't see very much. So we published this thing this morning called the Corona Shock. And the big thing we really spotted is the scale of the reduction in consumer spending. So the data set we're using is a data set that covers a group of banks' customers. We've got between 12 and 27% of the whole country. So in some areas it's as low as 12%, nowhere below 12%. In some areas it's as high as 27%. And it's a flow of spending of about £50 billion a year normally that we'll be able to see with this lens. And the big thing is that basically weekly spending has dropped by about 1/3 between the beginning of March and the end of March. That's all in non-grocery items. So the first person I'm actually going to come to is Jen Maitland-Hudson, who is from SIB, which is the charity we've been working with on this, who are basically interested in regeneration. I thought it'd be useful for actually getting her to talk about why it is that we're interested in this and what she thought the most sort of striking stuff was. So Jen, can I impose on you? Wherever you are. Hello? There we are, I can see you. That's you, yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, so this is data that we've been working with for a little while at SIB. And I started working on it precisely because we have an imperfect view of what's going on, usually in small areas up and down the country. And SIB works on regeneration. We're a social investor, we're a grant maker. And a lot of what we're trying to do is to support businesses and social businesses, charities, but also particularly working in areas of significant deprivation. And we have done that in the best ways that we know how, but it has tended to be quite qualitative, it's tended to be quite subjective, and we wanted to do something that gave us a bit more of a consistent view. So this data is data that's used by a marketing company. That's how we came to get hold of it. I did a huge search of organisations that might be able to help me to get access for public benefit to a better view of the country and local economies in particular. And I managed to persuade this marketing company that they should let us access this really rich data set that we can get down to ward level and see in a very granular way what's going on in local economies, particularly the flow of spending at a quite low level, which is what we're really interested in. We want to know what people who maybe don't have a huge amount of money, aren't running very large businesses, but what they're doing in their local areas and how they're spending. And this data gives us a really good view of that. And so we've been working with this for a while to help understand kind of what's going on in poorer areas, and it's given us this really useful picture. And then when the pandemic hit, it seemed to us that this was particularly useful data precisely because it's focused on spending. We can see grocery spend, we can see it at this very granular level. It's updated. We update it on a weekly basis, and we could do more with it, but at the moment it's a weekly update. So we can see things in real time. And I guess the thing that we are particularly interested in the differences between different parts of the country, and Chris and Ella have given a really amazing overview and some pretty fantastic graphics that help with that. Our graphics are extremely clunky. Our internal capacity to do this kind of work is, as you may imagine, we're a charity, it's pretty limited, so we do what we can. And this gives us a much kind of greater reach with the work that we're looking at. But for us, we have this particular focus on the social economy, on poorer places, on deprivation, and we think there's some really interesting stuff in there that we can pick up on. I'll stop there, Chris.
Were there any particular places you thought you were surprised by when we looked at the shock?
Yeah, so I think some of it was surprising to us, partly because we don't usually look at some of the places that clearly have been hit really hard. So I think that impact of education and the loss in university towns was not something we particularly thought about. We are interested in coastal towns anyway, and so we had an expectation that coastal towns would be struggling, but we tend to look at, say, Grimsby. We don't look so much at Penzance, and I think that's been a really interesting finding.
So for people who've not got through it all, I think the finding that I think surprised most people is that Oxford is one of the most severely hit towns. It's lost all its tourists. It's lost all of its students. So we think spending there in aggregate was down by about 60%. There are bigger, worse hit towns, which are littler, places like, as Jen mentioned, Penzance, but also there's a particular cluster in the southwest. Touristy towns. There are tourist towns in Cumbria, and we think that what's happening is that Cumbria has an earlier tourist season, so people will go to the Lake District normally in the spring when they wouldn't go on a bucket and spade holiday to Newquay. So we're seeing bigger losses in Cumbria compared to the same week last year than we are in Cornwall. But actually we've actually got, excitingly, the third week of data already. And looking at it this morning, one of the things that my colleague Ella Hollowood has spotted is that the bucket and spade places are starting to bleed through. So the losses are mounting in Cornwall because the foregone tourism week by week is going to rise and rise and rise. If we're still in lockdown, when the country gets really warm, if we get into the Maybank holidays, this is going to be devastating for those bucket and spade places. Lots of whom rely for a lot of their annual earnings on quite short periods of the year. So the tourism problem is one we haven't really talked enough about, but I think that's potentially going to be quite a big thing. Jen, what do you think in terms of like the public policy responses stuff that jumps out from you from this? What are you thinking about?
And we're thinking about a few things. There's a couple of existing very large funds. So there's the Towns Fund and the High Streets Fund, which may be familiar to people, which were already kind of earmarked funds for places that were struggling. And I think there's going to be a need to really think hard about how that money was going to be spent and whether it needs to be increased or whether it needs to be redeployed in different ways. And that I think is going to be a very, very significant piece of kind of recovery work that needs to happen. There's also work that's already in place from people like the Architectural Heritage Fund, who do a lot of work in actually coastal towns is one of the areas that they work in, supporting places that have significant heritage assets but very little income, very little turnover within those communities. So I think there's places like that where we're keen to try and influence how that money is spent, because it's it's money that's already there, so we're not asking for more, but we'd like it to be deployed a bit more intelligently. There's also, for us, there's a big role for better understanding the social economy and social infrastructure. The way that we deploy philanthropic funding, local government funding in this country is really unequal. So places that are already deprived don't necessarily get a fair share of money that's there to be spent on by charities, by trusts and foundations. And that's something we want we've been looking at in any event. It's kind of a big part of what we do, is to try and understand those gaps in support. I think this is going to, well, we've already done a bit of analysis of this that shows that those left behind areas are suffering even more than some other places. And so thinking about that and how we can better support them, and what kind of coordinated response there is that we can make, not us, just SIB, but as a wider sector, I think is going to be really important.
So one of the things we're going to do there's some things looking forwards that we want to sort of pick out more about. So the online is a really big thing. One of the things we highlight in the article is that large numbers of online businesses are literally in one ward in London. So the ward with Amazon in it has seen a tripling of apparent sales in Hoxton. I don't know if you've been to Hoxton. There's a lot of, trendy, not really my scene people, but it's a huge portion of British business is now apparently routed through this one ward, where Amazon and a few other big online businesses happen to be. We'll want to pick over some of those things in coming weeks. We're also going to have a look at some individual places, and there are some really big, one of the things I'm interested in and Jen's interested in is if we're all shopping much more locally, and one of the things you can see in the data is that places where the customers of the shops all live nearby are doing much better than places where people have to travel to spend. So Bluewater, absolutely stuffed, the big shopping centre in Thurrock. You can see Oxford Street is completely dead next to our normally where we live, Tortoise. But conversely, the sort of little suburban high streets are sort of doing okay, because basically the people who normally buy from them are still there. In fact, they're in the house longer and buying from them more. So we've seen this weird effect that there's sort of a donut in London. The inner city is losing heavily if it's not in the financial bits, because there's no one coming to Oxford Street. There's a ring around it of quite dense places where people are going to their local high streets and they're doing a bit better. Then in the outer suburbs where people live further apart, shops are doing worse again. So there are lots of these sort of quite weird, nuanced effects that we're going to sort of trace through. I think I was wondering if I could come to Polly, because one of the things I'm hoping we're going to be able to do is make this into something for our network to look at. So we're going to be looking deeply at Grimsby in particular, because we think first of all, SIB does work, SIB does work in Grimsby already, but also we've already got, we already have boots on the ground in Grimsby.
So yeah, we've been going to Grimsby for the last 6 months as part of our pre-election project, and to build a partnership with the local newsroom there and some charity partners, so that we have a kind of community of tortoise outside of London as well. We've been doing this in different towns and cities, but the Grimsby project is particularly close to my heart because that's where I have been returning to over the time. And through this period, I have been very conscious that we are all kind of confined to our bedrooms, doing journalism and reporting, and really wanting to kind of get out and about the country like any journalist would. You want to go and see how this is impacting on other people. So with one of our reporters, Tom Goulding, he's been working on a reporting project with our partners in Grimsby to try and get a sense of how the whole crisis is playing out differently there. And it is a really, really different story. Grimsby always has the problem that it's the end of the train line and there's no reason to go there unless you go there. And that has disadvantaged it economically in many ways. But actually, when it comes to coronavirus, it has one of the lowest rates of the illness in the country. So actually, health-wise, it's not being impacted yet very much. But economically, it's going to really feel the brunt of it because it hasn't got that much to lose. So through bringing together the reporting project we're doing in Grimsby and the brilliant work that Chris and Ella are doing, we want to kind of get a real insight into one area of the country that is also very kind of totemic of that whole kind of left behind a conversation that we saw in the run up to the election.
So if there are things that you think we should be looking at, this is to everyone, not just Polly, if there are things you think we should be looking at, you let us know, because we're keen to work out what the sort of right question is. We're sort of starting out on this sort of journey with this data, and we can sort of look for specific types of things. I'm also interested in petrol stations. I wonder how much of this is petrol stations, right? So if people are no longer driving, we can see a massive decline in areas where there are lots of people who are employed in like air travel, and we can see a massive decline in places where people are related to the car selling trade, not car making, car selling, and car repair. Trying to find these nuances about what the lockdown is doing to different sectors is interesting. Can I come to Yelena, who I see has put her hand up?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Perfect. I think what you were just saying, Chris, about consumption is really, really fascinating. I'm working on a piece as part of the Net Zero by 2030 piece at the moment. And it's looking at food security. So literally just before this call, I was speaking to some people who are working on trying to make supply chains more traceable, specifically local supply chains. And they were saying that it's really interesting in two respects how this has shaped consumption, because on the first level, yes, we've pointed out that we can't phase out farming and solely depend on imports. We do need to have a strong domestic food production industry. But at the same time, they were arguing that it's really pointed out our problematic approach to consumption in so many different ways, how we consume things at an alarming rate and sort of mindlessly in some respects. And actually, for our food industry to be more sustainable, we do need to be consuming less. We do need to be looking at certain local alternatives, but also some international ones. So it's interesting, actually, because from people within the food industry, COVID is a kind of watershed moment that's actually exposing issues that needed to be dealt with anyway. So that's really interesting what you were saying about how consumption.
Ooh, I think we're slightly losing you. Yes. We're slightly losing the sound, but we caught 95% of you, I think. I think there's a really good, thank you for that. There's a really good question about how we look beyond. So what we've got is data that shows how consumers are spending. We can't really see what sort of beyond that at the moment. So there's a good, we're interested in supply chains definitely, and what exactly this will do. What we sort of, hope is the wrong word. What we sort of anticipate is that if you start losing chunks of business, say car retail business I mentioned before, in areas, we'll start seeing that reflected in consumption statistics in the local area. So we'll start seeing people affected by, for example, the closure of car dealerships in how much people are spending on food in the local area, which is grim, but we sort of anticipate that. We can already see the areas where, for example, like the air freight is a good example. Air freight doesn't appear in our basket, right? No one's buying, people aren't buying en masse, space on Galaxy aircraft to ship things, but areas with a large number of people who work in air freight are seeing declines in shop consumption because those people are staying home and doing less. So Keith Duddleston just asked whether the lockdown is working to reduce the number of excess deaths measured by the ONS. I think you'd have to say yes. It must be, it's definitely working. The question is whether it's worth the cost. Keith, do you have any broader thoughts, Keith?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, yes, I've got a bit of a preoccupation about this, but it's just that Sweden doesn't have a lockdown and hasn't had the huge number of deaths predicted by Professor Ferguson. So I'm quite worried that although everybody believes the lockdown has to be working, Really, it isn't. I could talk more about it if you wanted.
I think what we can say with certainty is that reducing contacts between people will be reducing the infection rate. That must be true as a point of fact.
That's what Sweden's done. Absolutely.
But also, no. So we can say with certainty that our lockdown is reducing the spread of the infection. That is of like fact must be true. But
why? How do you know that?
Because it must be like it is, because that's how infections work. But the issue with Sweden is that the lockdown is much more severe than people are giving it credit for. That they have closed. We're saying they're not locked down. They are social distancing. They have closed schools. They have closed nurseries.
Some schools are open, and all pubs and restaurants are open, and you can go outside as much as you like.
Yeah. But it is more. I think it's more partly a difference of framing more than a difference of. It's worth reporting on, but it's a difference of framing rather than a difference.
I think it is. I'll shut up, but I do think it is worth reporting on, because it was said we would have 10 times the number of deaths unless we had the lockdown, and we really haven't had that. In fact, Sweden's rate's lower at the moment. I mean, it may not stay lower, which seems to me it's the one place that didn't have a lockdown. So we ought to see the consequences of that clearly, but we don't.
Sure. I mean, there are lots of questions to lots of broader things. I've actually been looking, because obviously I'm slightly limited in my access to books. There's a really good book by a French sociologist about family shape. And one of the things about Britain is we have a very unusual family structure in that young people who, when they get married, always leave home in the UK. We've never had like the Dolmio sauce commercial families with people living multi-generationally. And lots of these social things are things that people are underplaying, I suspect. Part of the reason why Northern Italy may be worse than Southern Italy is because they have a more, for want of a better phrase, Dolmio family structure than the South. There are lots of these things that I think we shouldn't be. I think our ability to actually analyse cross-country is quite limited, given none of us can leave our houses at the moment. But I think Sweden is interesting. I think, and the extent to which Sweden is like it's a difference of enforcement as opposed to a difference of actual outcomes is interesting too. James, I see, is keen to speak. The boss. Hang on, you're still muted, James.
I'm here. Hey, Chris. By the way, I totally agree with Keith on this point about Sweden. So for what it's worth, Keith, my cousins in Sweden, we had one of those terrible family Zoom calls about 2-3 weeks ago, where he was basically terrified and thought that what Sweden was doing was an act of kind of mad Scandinavian arrogance. And we of course all chuckled and thought the same. And now I'm looking at the latest numbers, and deaths still below 2,000. Now what I don't know is where they are in the experience of getting the virus and the spread of it. But you're right. And actually Giles Whittell, who I think is on the call, we did talk about trying to do something in the sense maker that would try and look at that specifically. So it's in the works, but it's a good prod to be reminded of it.
Death rate after, I think it's 3 deaths. It's about the same as ours. My point is, it doesn't need to. We don't have to be concerned if it's lower or the same. It ought to be a lot more if the lockdown is doing what it was predicted to do.
Yes, that's true. I think Giles is saying we'll take a proper look. So I would, rather than speculate on something I don't understand, and short of calling my cousin and not being able to hear him on a family Zoom call, I'll leave it to Giles to pick up. But Chris, I actually put my hand up for something different, which was just to say, I know that one of the advantages of having a sort of data set like this is you can layer other things on it. I know we talked before publishing a little bit about the difference between the places that are bearing the brunt of the health crisis and the places that are going to bear the long-term pain of the economic crisis, and how, when you look at the map that you and Ella and Chris Newell put together, it's really striking how many of those red dots are, if you like, on the coast, sort of around the country, and the question of whether or not the economic recovery will happen in the centre of the country. One thing I wondered, and maybe it's just not possible, is, you know, the last decade has been very, very good for people who've got assets, who've got money, because the aftermath of the financial crisis was a period of long, low interest rates. Well, the OBR is predicting that we'll have interest rates below 1% for 5 years. So if you've got money, right, if you're a private equity firm that's got money, or if you're an individual who's sitting on a valuable house or significant savings, there's going to be something very interesting that happens that potentially doesn't accelerate the leveling, but accelerates the inequality, in that people are going to have assets to buy things, and there's some people who are not going to have much. And I didn't know whether or not in the data, it's possible to look at savings data as well as spending data. There's a way of kind of overlaying assets as well as what's happening in terms of spending.
So I think we can have a go, right? So we can have a look. I think one of the hard question we can't quite get to, I don't think, is on, if you like, the distribution of the people, right? So I would anticipate that people on very low incomes aren't reducing their spending by anything, if at all, because, you know, they're fundamentally, the cost of their groceries hasn't gone down. It's probably gone up because they're having to shop at smaller local shops where things cost more. That's a thing we want to look into. And so savings rates are an interesting thing, because it may be that there's actually a group of fundamentally well-off people who are no longer commuting, no longer spending money on the train fare, who have carried on earning and are actually generating a decent cash pile at the moment. On your question on if you like, pre-existing real assets, which have appreciated over the last decade, I think we can definitely have a look at where trying to sort of mesh that together. It's worth a try. We don't have individual level data, we have sort of localized data, so we might miss the point. It might be that if you're a rich banker, you buy your house in Devon, you know, we can't see the linkage to the, you know, and we can't attribute, if you like, the rise in the asset value to the right ownership place, if that makes sense. So I'm not sure. We'll have to think about that. One of the things I'm really interested in is something that Hazel Blears said when I spoke to her about this, who is the chair of SIB, which is that she said one of the grim things about this is that there was a wave of infection early on that came from second homeowners. So the tourist towns have had a disproportionate number of corona cases. So their local hospitals are a little more strained than you'd expect, but their local economy is now suffering, just as if just because basically the Londoners are staying away, so they're having a sort of double problem. My colleague Kerry had his hand up, but he appears to have put it down. Kerry?
Yeah, I put it down for a reason. Which is I was going to talk about Sweden. I think you've moved on, so I was going to let you go.
Oh, okay, all right. Oliver Bush asked, are we able to track residential and commercial rental payments? Oliver, are you on? Can we come to you? Because I think one of the questions I'm interested in with this is, if you like, the flows we can't see. So and I think that's a really important one. We can see, I think Jem will correct me if I'm wrong, we can see basically rent going out in quite a high volume. Not everyone's, I suspect, but rents going out in quite high volumes for residential rents, because that will come up as a payment. But what are you thinking?
No, just that it seemed to me that there was a pretty clear message. I can't remember exactly when it came, that you shouldn't be kicking out tenants at the moment. And so a lot of people, you know, either they can't pay because they haven't got the income, or they take this as a signal that they don't need to pay. So I'm just wondering what problems that's going to lead to down the line, in terms of court cases to recover rents, in terms of the extra debt, extra liabilities that are incurred by companies and renters when the lockdown ends and we reverse to a policy of paying rent
Okay, so Jen, I see Jen is there. Hello.
Yeah. So hello.
Hello. Yeah.
Yeah. So we can. The data that we've shared with Tortoise so far doesn't include all of the data that we have. We can look at the wallet spend of individual people as well. I mean, we aggregate it up, so it's not personally identifiable, but we can look at outgoings from accounts as well. So we have ways of trying to work out the proportion of utilities payments, the proportion of rent, proportion of mortgage payments, those kinds of things. But we do that analysis by place. So what we tend to see is that there are places in the country where people's utilities as a percentage of their expenditure on a monthly basis is much higher than others. So it's that sort of distribution of kind of poverty. So there are more things that we could do to look at that. And there might be things that we could do to look at, to match particular places that we know already have residents who are paying more, and we could look at whether not paying rental payments is making a difference at the moment, and try and see what happens post-COVID and whether that makes any particular change. So we can look at that. The other thing that we've matched so far is we have matched some benefit calculator data from a charity called Tortoise, which shows huge rises in the number of people who are now eligible for benefits. And again, that's not distributed evenly across the country. And we found that in the left behind areas that we'd already previously identified, those rises are considerable. It's almost 200% people who are now eligible for benefits. So we are seeing, it's not just it's not just spending that's being hit. It's not just those local economies. It is people who are falling into debt, and in particular places that are very deprived. What you're seeing is the need to continue spending on groceries and a slight rise in grocery spend, but you're also seeing almost certainly a loss of income, and so an effect on people's ability to get by, and that's leading to these rises in benefits, in benefit eligibility.
So one of the things you've already pulled out from the data, Jen, is about, which we've not yet talked about in the articles, is about the baskets. So you can see rises in the amount that people are spending per shop. Have you spotted anything in there yet?
So we haven't done much on it yet because we found it very fuzzy and difficult to interpret. So the rises are not as big as you would think. So I think we had expected to see quite significant rises in the amount that people were spending on their groceries on a weekly basis, or however often they're shopping, and in fact we haven't seen rises that are that significant. In deprived areas, the rises are actually only £2 or £3 probably per basket of shopping, but that £2 or £3 for those people is a really significant amount of their outgoings, and that's the big difference, I think, is that if £3 is 25% of your grocery shopping, that's a really considerable thing, and it's very difficult to stockpile. It's very difficult. We already know about the poverty premium in any event, that it's more expensive to be poor, and it remains more expensive to be poor. And if you're actually, your point, I was going to try and jump in earlier about petrol stations and Grimsby, but one of the things we already know about petrol stations in Grimsby is that in certain parts of the town, the petrol station is the only local shop. And if you're buying your groceries from a petrol station, because that's the only place you can walk to, you can well imagine that there's a significant premium on your shopping. Gosh,
yeah, and the easy availability of barbecue briquettes on the plus side, and bad flowers. I wonder about whether so Yasmin in the chat, can we come to Yasmin? She's brought up these issues, some of these issues around, there we are, hello.
Hi.
About domestic violence, which obviously quite a real worry with the lockdown.
I don't really necessarily have any solutions. All I know is that, and people have sort of talked about this more broadly before, but the idea of home being somewhere that is safe and self-isolation being something that is okay for people, I think is an assumption that doesn't apply to everyone. My sort of knowledge of the stats around DV tend to be more current in Australia, but I do know there are analogies here in the UK. And the numbers of calls to domestic violence helplines have skyrocketed, and the deaths as well, the killings. I know that in the Tortoise report that I read, I think today, something like in the last couple of weeks, the number of killings have tripled. Part of the challenge is there is nowhere for people to go. So I know from Australia, the statistic, it takes about 11 times for a woman in a domestic violence situation to attempt to leave before she successfully does. 11 attempts to leave a violent situation before she's essentially successful. And part of that is lots of refuges are full or aren't taking people. And it's much more, it's easier sometimes for them to return, especially if there are children involved and so on. And so the fact that a lot of refuges currently are losing funding and are not, people aren't necessarily donating to those, they might be donating to other places, I think is a significant challenge. And also, if you can't go outside, there is no relief, no escape. And additionally, if men are losing work, that typically tends to be an exacerbating factor as well. And it's something that is also challenging for us to think about how we can support. I'd be curious to see what work is being done, and perhaps this is something that Tortoise could sort of do a deeper dive into for folks to be able to support.
So thanks ever so much. We did a thing I thought I'd come to Kerry, my colleague now, who's now finally, I'm sure will deign to speak now. Who produced a podcast a little while ago on domestic violence and where we are. Yes, Kerry.
So this was Yasmin. Hi, hi. This was 3 weeks ago. We did a podcast, so quite early days actually in the lockdown. And the picture that we came across then was that the particular refuge that we were focusing on had just begun to see a big spike in calls. That actually what had happened was that there'd been a period when calls had gone really quiet, which worried them even more because they suspected that women didn't have the means to make calls. No one thought there wasn't anything going on. But what they were seeing was that, as you were saying, that the usual avenues that women might use to get out of a bad place were closed off to them. So you couldn't, if you were locked in a house with an abusive partner, then you probably couldn't pick up the phone. A lot of the opportunities that women use to get themselves into refuges will be when they're out and about anyway, picking up the kids from school or out doing the shopping, and then you're out and you can carry on. And then of course in the system there's a reliance on a certain amount of movement. You have to have, these refuges are not huge places. They need people to come into them and go out of them. And if the way out is blocked, then it's much more difficult for them to accommodate people on the way in. So they were expecting to have people on camp beds in corridors and, for already quite difficult circumstances to get much worse. And I think what you're talking about now, the rise in calls, the contact, particularly with apps, which seem to be perhaps an easier way to report, seems to be spiking. And as both you have said and my colleague Matt has said in the chat, we have seen this rise in domestic violence killings already, which has been seen in France, in Spain, in Greece, in China, all over the place. I'm afraid it feels like this problem that we're not going to get full sight of until this is over, and the picture when it comes could be really horrible.
That's well. So onto a slightly different theme. So Ed Dowding in the comments. Can we go to Ed? Ed says 91% of Britons don't want to go back to normal after this. And what are the options for refocusing the social contract? So one of the things I'm sort of interested in all this is how we work out what we're going to, the balance of basically reporting on what's going on now and where we should go is actually quite difficult, not least since we sort of need to know what's happening now to work out what the sort of potential consequences are and what we need to learn. But Ed, what's your thoughts? I feel like you're posing questions but have an answer.
I wish I had an answer. I think there are lots of potential answers, and lots of potential ways through it. I'm not entirely sure we need to know where we're at now in order to know where we want to go. I don't think that's ever been true. It wasn't true when they wrote the Beveridge report or did the every other social change that's happened in history. It wasn't true when the suffragettes, I suppose it was actually, they knew they didn't have the vote and they knew they wanted it. But it strikes me that we've never had a situation before where the engine has stopped, and we have an opportunity to collectively around the world work out what we want to do. The counter arguments against change are always, oh, well, yes, but let's do it next year, and let's postpone, and now we can recalibrate. And you look at South Korea, who's using the new Green Deal, and they voted in the new government to use the new Green Deal to use that as a social and economic infrastructure on which to hang their recovery. I think opportunities like that presents really nice ways out of this, and it'd be interesting to know who's doing what, how different countries are using these sort of new deals, new social contracts to get out of it.
Okay, so this comes to a thing we've talked about a bit before, which is this question of when a crisis is just a crisis, which is going to eat all your time, and when an opportunity. And my instinct is always to sort of, because I'm a terrible cynic, to always think, the firefighting is basically going to take all of the bandwidth for quite a long time. It's, beverage is kind of easy, right? You send one guy off on his own during the Second World War. He's not going to be fighting, right? He's an old man by this point. If you send him off on his own, he thinks up this stuff. He knows what the problems are. If you look, you look through the beverage report, it's like a list of five big ills we have to destroy. So I'm not sure I totally buy the idea that it's necessarily easier to move now.
It's easier to get people buying into the idea. It might be easier to get people pledging to a world that they want to work towards now. The beverage report was in 1942 and had something like 95% popular support across the country. And obviously in a time of great darkness, it's nice to give people a light at the end of the tunnel, even if you don't say when that tunnel's going to be. But knowing that there is something worth hoping for at the end of it, that all this war is fighting for something, not just against something. And that same, I think we have that same opportunity. Amsterdam has just adopted donut economics and using that as a model
what's that mean?
Donut economics is a model put forward by Kate Raworth, which essentially, rather than having the single bottom line of GDP or city budget in the case of Amsterdam, it's looking at environmental limits on one side and social floor limits on the other side. So fall below that line and you're basically not civilized. Go over that line and you break the planet. You break your world, and everything else, health and biodiversity, it starts to suffer. And so between that, in that safe space is your donut, as she describes it. And so that's her safe and just space for a flourishing society. And knowing that our countries are choosing to, or our civic organizations or our companies are choosing to put that sort of breadth as a goal. It's not just short-term profit maximization, it's resilience, flourishing, prosperity, as a broader set of goals rather than shareholder returns.
Right, I see. I think the reason for my skepticism is also partly that I think we're gonna come out of this looking at this enormous bill. So it's one we can comfortably afford. We're not gonna hit any sort of sovereign debt problems anytime soon. But the politics of that are quite hard to sell. It's quite hard to sort of persuade people. Relax. It's time for let's go on a nice holiday. Let's think about something else. Let's try and do something even more ambitious. I worry that we're going to be sort of in a clinch for sort of a.
Although on the flip side, I worry that we're going to then have if the outcome of 2007 was 10 years of austerity, and that was less money being spent than is coming out now. If the outcome of this is, sorry guys, 20 years of tightening everything down and not spending any money on public services, screw that. You know, that's an unacceptable outcome for essentially what has been an awful lot of global poor governance globally.
That's okay. So I should say, if there are other things you think we should be looking at, it's really hard to get beyond the scale of this enormous crisis. Like, it's so mind-alteringly large, what's happening with the coronavirus, and it's so uncertain. I know that some people in the NHS are talking about the Nightingale hospitals being in use basically for 12 to 18 months from here. And that would reflect the fact that some special conditions would have to remain in force for at least 12 to 18 months. It's really hard to sort of think beyond that horizon. It's really difficult to not be fixated with this thing. But there are things that people think we should be looking at. This is a good opportunity to say. So my colleague Tessa has raised her hand. Tessa. Okay, I like the spirit of doing this job because I bet to behave like a local radio DJ.
Well, it's also because it's the only chance you ever get to shut me up, Chris. I was just going to say that the thing I have on my mind is, I know we've had one thinking with young people in terms of the impact in the short term on exams and education, which was brilliant. But I'd like to go back to young people again, because for two reasons. One, well, mainly because the inheritance that they've got coming down the line, which they already feel very strongly in terms of climate change, is deeply unfair. And back to James's point about the inequality of capital distribution and what that's going to show up in terms of the social inequality. And when it comes to thinking about what we want to hang on to and what we want the new world order to look like after this, I think it is really time that we gave younger people's voices a shout. You know, they are the generation that's going to have to rebuild for a really long time. And I'd be really interested, and not just from a UK perspective, but, you know, this is a global challenge to youth to become the leadership, you know, that we need to build our way out of this. I'd be really interested in going back to them for that conversation.
Right. I think Keith, car use has dropped off dramatically, Keith, who spoke to us earlier, may not recover. Car sharing may become a longer term effect. I have this realization that I inherited a diesel car, which I'm supposed to be selling because I live in central London, and I can't use it without paying £1 million for the ultra low emission zone. I think psychologically it'd be much easier for me to sell it now. Like, I haven't used it for ages. How long it is we are living in this weird liminal space inside our houses while working is going to be have quite big, broad sort of psychological impacts, I suspect, Keith. Can I come back to Jen, actually, just to address that thought on young people in particular. So given that you basically fund and examine 1,000 different things, is there anything in that space?
Yeah, so we're also we're one of the partnership that runs the Youth Endowment Fund. And the Youth Endowment Fund is a £200 million fund for youth violence. And actually that's on the kind of what's happening now and what will happen thing. It's really interesting. There's obviously a bit of an existential question here, because it's a what works centre. The Youth Endowment Fund, we're supposed to be working with evidence. And there's this curious thing. This is the lockdown is, if nothing else, it's a hell of an experiment in keeping kids off the streets. And we know with youth violence that's where violence happens. And so I think there's going to be a whole lot of really interesting questions about the effect that have. And we're starting to think with the Youth Endowment Fund about what happens as we come out of this and young people are back out of their own homes. And what does that mean? Is a positive effect potentially of this, that those sort of spikes in youth violence that we've seen in the last few years, have those been broken? Has something happened here that's actually disrupted a very problematic pattern, a very dangerous pattern of behaviour? So there could be these completely unexpected positives, but only if we kind of know how to look at that and how to contend with the problem afterwards. So we are starting to ask ourselves some of those questions about young people and young people's voices in particular as part of the recovery phase. I don't know if that's a slightly specific answer to a wider question.
Yeah, I should say, I first met Jen some years ago because she used to work at Kids Company. And
I blew the whistle. I would like to make it clear.
One of the goodies. Can I come to Kate? Because I'm just intrigued by your observation about the fact that there may be some young people on your street who are which may Kate CAIT.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, they're quite happily working away with their cars drawing up next to them, but they're socially distancing and they're all masked up, which is amusing me no end. Because I suppose people are bored and they've got a bit more, and they've got cash and they don't know what to spend it on. So yeah, they're doing a fairly roaring trade.
I mean, yeah, we wouldn't want to send our drug dealers out without the right PPE. I mean,
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you ever so much. Where do you live, by the way?
North London.
Ah, I see. There you go, Jen. That's something to keep an eye on. Okay, yeah, we have to. Yeah, the responsibility of different employees is something that's coming into focus in this crisis. Can I come back to Yasmin as well? Yasmin, you're quite worried about the Tessa's point, basically, young people.
Hi. Yeah, I sort of wanted to back that up, and I think it's so I was born in 91, which means that the difference between myself and, say, the younger millennials and Gen Z is only a few years. But at least I remember a pre-9/11 world, right? I was 10 when 9/11 happened, and so there was a time when things didn't seem like a constant flight into disaster, with no employment opportunities, etc. And reading this piece, I shared a piece in the chat, but it seems to me that the generation growing up now has come of age in a time where everything is kind of a disaster. There is no, there's no system that works really well for them. A lot of the reference points that people have in the generations, but I mean, this is nothing new, but imagine literally never living in a world where things work as they're meant to. I think it's quite sobering, and I do wonder, I do think the solutions will probably come from them, but I do think that maybe they're not going to be the kind of the solutions that older generations are happy with. Challenge, of course, being that these are also a typically non-voting bloc, or they vote less. Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I think a good reporting thing for us to look at is basically cohorts by people arranged by birth time, because I have this sort of, it's an odd thing that I started work as a financial journalist just before the financial crisis, and in my head, oil is $40 a barrel. It costs 4% to borrow for 10 years for a government. All of my sort of benchmarks are the pre-crisis ones, and I always have to sort of go, no, hang on, that's ridiculous. That hasn't been like that for 10 years. And actually the extent to which we're shaped by these sort of circumstances, and the way that people who like me slipped out just before the last crisis, and people who not that actually quite a long way before the last crisis, if I'm honest, and the people who've come of age in this period and the people who come of age in the Corona period are going to have quite different experiences. One of the things I find amazing is that the London housing market appears to be the single most robust thing on earth as well. So why haven't we seen, there's someone has sold a house on my street for an obscene amount of money. Won't benefit me, unfortunately, but someone has obviously bought it without looking at it. I don't know what's happening. Sorry, this is just a middle-aged rant now, but Liz Mosley, can I speak to you in your capacity as someone who's herding children at the moment as well?
Yes.
Bluntly, how is it
Well, I don't live with my children in the week, so they live with their dad. But I think that the last weekend before last was the first weekend that I started to just see just little things. You know, my son didn't sleep. He'd had a nightmare where he was being asked to decide which people in our family and friends were going to live and which were going to die. And my daughter has been pulling her eyelashes out, which is like the beginnings of some sort of anxiety coping thing. And they're both normally incredibly robust, lovely, jolly. I mean, they are still jolly and well-adjusted, fun little people to be around. But I think, you know, we're in week 5 of this now. And I just, you know, if you're 10 and 8 and suddenly someone says there's no school and you think, well, hey, and then you can't see your friends and you can't go to the park and you hear on the news, and it's just horrendous, really. It's incredibly frightening, really like a horror film for grown-ups. And we've heard a lot about people moaning about their exam results. There's been a huge amount of coverage for that. And as Tessa says, the impact on the future generations we tend to think of as sort of teenagers. But I think children's mental health, especially in a house when your mum and dad are also feeling anxious, I think it's really frightening. And I haven't read or seen too much about how to help and what to say.
So Oliver Bush has pointed out there's some work that's been done on experiences of like the Great Depression on people's behaviour. That's worth thinking about. I think I'm one of 5 kids, and the thing I can't get, my next door neighbour has I point to the wall, has a 3-year-old who is desperate for the company of children and has started basically talking to adults as a sort of terrible substitute. But I sort of feel really sorry for them. Like they've got no one to play with. You know, no one good to play with anyway. Only old people. Anyway, look, it is 1:58 according to my clock. So I should start wrapping up so you can all get back to you know another room in your house. The things I think the things that we really want to take away from this are we should definitely look at Sweden properly. Like it must be the case that locking down reduces infection spread. The question is whether the balances are right. It's also possible, of course, that different countries with different social models will have different correct responses, but that's really interesting too. I think the domestic violence stuff is something we have to sort of keep going with because it's too difficult and too important, basically, not to. I think James's question about the interaction with the last 10 years of asset growth I think that's hard for us to look at, but we can have a try. We can see what we can do. But I wonder whether young people is the big thing we should take out of this. I think not just the revelation that London drug dealers are socially responsible employers, but also that what this might be doing, or under the bonnet in lots of families, and I'm partly because of my own background, sort of intrigued by, as ever, by only children, and what it will mean for people who have other little people in the house and people who don't. So I'll let you get back to your lives. Thank you ever so much for your time. As ever, if you're not a member, I can't remember everyone here is. I'm looking at Liz, hoping she's going to give me a signal. If you're not a member, there is everyone here is. But you should sell memberships onto your friends. You can go to tortoisemedia.com and push on from there. But we hope to see you soon. This week, we have the dear leader himself, Tony Blair, in a Thinking, and we have Jess Phillips. We've also got later on this week, Ruth Davidson speaking about the response to coronavirus. There are lots and lots of jolly events. And yes, thank you ever so much for your time. I'll release you. Bye-bye. I should wave. James always makes everyone wave as they're leaving. I haven't got the patter down yet.